Buenos días todos, señores y señoras. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Je me présente, chers amis, mon nom est Sonia Benezra et je suis votre maître de cérémonie pour aujourd'hui. Es un gran honor y un placer estar hoy aquí, orgullosa de mis raíces hispanas, gracias a que mis padres vienen de España y de la región española de Tánger en Marruecos. I'm very happy to be welcoming you to Montreal for the 5th Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in the Americas. Es la primera vez que la plataforma regional se reúne en Canadá y estamos muy contentos de recibirlos. Espero que sus discusiones sean fructíferas y que le guste la ciudad de Montreal y mi bello país. ¿Estáis bien? ¿Estáis feliz? Ok, perfecto. El día va a ser estupendo. Bienvenidos a todos. On va faire ça dans les 3 langues. On va parler les 3 langues. We're going to speak the 3 languages, and any other language you want to throw in, feel free. J'ai pris connaissance de l'horaire qui s'annonce très prometteur et bien rempli. Alors continuons sans plus tarder parce qu'on a une grosse journée planifiée pour vous. We have among us, ladies and gentlemen, the minister who ensures the safety and security of Canada for our citizens and all our visitors. Canada, however, like many other countries, is not immune to disasters, as you will see in the next presentation. Please welcome warmly our guest, the Honorable Ralph Goodale, Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, accompanied by the Indigenous elders.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ralph Goodale, the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness for Canada. And welcome, everyone, to Canada, especially all of our guests from around the American hemisphere. Bienvenidos, bienvenue, and welcome to the 5th Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in the Americas. I'm very pleased over these next 3 days to join more than 1,000 delegates from over 50 countries and territories within North, South, and Central America and the Caribbean. Canada believes very much in multiculturalism and in the work of the vital organizations like the United Nations. On behalf of all of us, let me begin this regional platform by thanking our partners at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction for helping us put together what I believe is a comprehensive, exciting, and inspiring program over the next 3 days. And I'm honored to note that we are gathered today at the meeting point of various Indigenous peoples and First Nations, including the Algonquins and the Mohawks, and the Inuit and the Métis people are also with us here today. And I want to thank them for making us feel so welcome. 2017 marks the 150th anniversary of the Confederation of 4 provinces that began the formation of Canada in 1867. And our 150 years as a country has shown that Canada is no stranger to issues like disaster response and preparedness, which is the subject of this meeting. That is due, in large part, perhaps because we are the world's second largest country geographically, spanning 6 time zones from east to west. We also enjoy the world's longest coastline. We have 15 distinct and separate ecozones in Canada, with a climate that ranges from the high Arctic down to the same latitude as the state of California. And like many of our hemispheric partners here today, we experience a full range of natural and man-made hazards. Most recently, that was evident in the ice storm that hit our Atlantic provinces a few weeks ago. Evident as well last year in the beast of a wildfire that swept through Fort McMurray in northern Alberta. And obvious as well in the rail disaster in 2013 that devastated the community of Lac-Mégantic in Quebec. In our relatively brief existence as a country, Canada has built substantial resilience to all of the threats that come our way, from great fires and floods to tornadoes and droughts, hurricanes and earthquakes, to pandemics of influenza. But beyond the capacity of any one country, we in the Americas are all part of the modern collective commitments of 187 countries under the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Those commitments are to substantially reduce the loss of life and the damage to health and livelihoods from disasters. Commitments that help us make sure that we all understand accurately the risks and the vulnerabilities and our capacity to cope with them. And commitments that help ensure that we're all on the same page, learning from each other and collaborating whenever and wherever we can. That same commitment to multi-partner collaboration has recently helped us here in Canada to develop the first iteration of our federal floodplain mapping guidelines. These evergreen documents will help us better address overland flooding, which is Canada's costliest hazard. We'll strengthen our floodplain mapping right across the country. And more details on these Canadian guidelines will be forthcoming during this regional platform. We're also at work in Canada on an inclusive set of federal, provincial, territorial consultations toward a modern, comprehensive, all-hazard, pan-Canadian emergency management strategy. But let me put aside our specific Canadian activities for a moment, because our gathering today comes at a point when some countries are just recovering from some of the very adversities that we are here in Montreal to discuss. Our friends in Chile, for example, have very recently experienced heavy rains and landslides in the Andes Mountains, only a short while after seeing a chain of wildfires that unleashed devastation on a scale never seen before. California, too, had a brutal summer of wildfires in 2016 that left hundreds of homes and many thousands of acres destroyed. And then through this winter, reports of heavy rain and flooding in California. And we all remember last year's Hurricane Matthew that brought destruction to both the Caribbean and the Southeast United States. Our thoughts are, of course, with the families and the loved ones of all those who've lost their lives in these disasters. And of course, our deepest appreciation and admiration goes to the first responders of all kinds who came to the rescue. It is remarkable and highly valuable that all countries have this regular venue, the Sendai framework and the regional platforms, to discuss the opportunities that we share, and much of the content here is broadcast worldwide, simultaneously and online. We need to make very good use of our time together to move forward on a robust regional action plan, a plan that can increase the open exchange of data, science, research, and technology among us all that can save lives worldwide. A plan that is grounded in the Sendai framework's guiding principles, that can help us strengthen how we organize, prepare, budget, and govern, and how we engage critical partners like those invaluable volunteers. And a plan that can help us use our collective influence to increase the numbers of countries and territories and organizations that do have strategies in place to reduce the risk of disasters. Over the course of this platform through the next 3 days, announcements will be made about indicators responding to the priorities that we have set out in our regional action plan. And together, I am absolutely confident the work of these 3 days will arrive at our goal for a collective outcome enshrined in what we will call the Montreal Declaration, to be presented to the global platform in Cancun later on this spring. I want to wish you all a very successful meeting. I want to thank Minister Coiteau from the Government of Quebec and Madame Sanson from the City of Montreal for being with us here this morning. Their participation in and support for this platform is deeply appreciated. And now, to move us forward in a good way, to get this platform started properly and appropriately, I want to call on 4 Indigenous representatives of Canada to offer a prayer and to launch our discussion. And may I call forward Ms. Rose Wawati from the Algonquin Nation, Mr. Kevin Deere of the Mohawk Nation, Mr. Jim DeRocher of the Métis Nation, and Mr. David Sercoke of the Inuit peoples, to launch our platform with a prayer. And may I say to the elders, thank you for being here.
Je voudrais vous présenter quand même notre prochaine invité. Indigenous Canadians are one of our country's founding peoples, and they have a history, a culture, and traditions to share with us, including a welcome to country by elders ceremony. Since we are presently on Algonquin and Mohawk territory, I would invite Ms. Rose Wawati, representative of the Algonquin Nation, to give us a traditional welcome.
Kwekena, Rose Wawati Bodwendishnakas, Taganak, Ngujo, Odyssey. Welcome, everybody. My name is Rose Wawati Bodwe. I am a proud Algonquin and Anishinaabe Ikwe. Born and raised in Rapid Lake, and I am a member of Kitigan-Zibi First Nation. First of all, it is an honor for me to be here today to welcome the world to our home and native land, to our beautiful country called Canada, which in my Algonquin language means a safe haven. This area called Montreal was shared territory by Mohawks and Algonquin Nation, and it is my understanding that we still share this territory today. As I look around me, I see beautiful faces. I sense warmth, and I know this room is filled with brilliant minds. We are all here to fulfill our roles, big or small, to work together in unity. As the keepers of this land we call Mother Earth, we are all responsible to ensure a healthy and safe planet for future generations. In carrying out this responsibility, in my culture, we first give thanks to the Creator for the abundance of natural gifts placed on earth for our survival and our lives. I will now go on to give thanks to the Creator in my language. Kinde benjiget, oman jojo aki. Kinige gonga gi gishendaman. Kinuwe sisik, mitugok, nibi. Newan wejinwek. Jesus, tibaki Jesus, wanakshik, mamui shkude. We do koshanang taman na madziak. We go dan taman mamui kena. Kigamana do dadman, kigasagidman, pepejik kene etchik. Mishkanawik, Pichki yet, Kitamina, what the tick, Kish, Ska, Mauji de Uma. Kina books in a minimum, Gemina dog, Nakudom Meda, Ginishanabe, Mikiji yacht, was the Kabu de yacht. Mi guardas que didn't know my vishaik. In my prayers, I will translate a little bit of my prayers, giving thanks to the Creator on Mother Earth for the animals, the trees, the water, the four directions, and the four colors. Thanking for the sun, the moon, the stars, and the fire. Help to live a good and healthy life. Work together in unity. Be kind and love one another. Grant everybody a safe journey at the end of this gathering. I wish you all enjoyable and safe stay in our beautiful country called Canada. Miigwech.
Thank you very, very much, Mrs. Rose Rawadi, for those kind words filled with compassion and hope bringing us back to the values that we all should remember. And that's not on my paper. Thank you. It was really heartfelt. It is my pleasure now to invite Regional Chief Craig Mackinac, representative of the Assembly of the First Nations, to now say a few words.
Good morning. Tamskat Nyao Kioao. It's good to be here today at the UN 5th Regional Platform on Disaster Reduction. I'd just like to acknowledge the ministers that are here, the premiers, the delegates from throughout Canada, and throughout the Americas that are here for the next few days here, as we're here to talk about disaster reduction. I'd just like to give thanks to the Mohawks of Kanawagi and whose territory are meeting today. Indigenous peoples are among the most marginalized peoples and the most likely to suffer serious and extreme impacts of natural disasters. Hundreds of First Nations households are forcibly evacuated every year due to flooding, wildfires, or natural disasters. The effects of dislocation are far-reaching on mental and physical health, on harvesting rights, on food security, on education, and particularly devastating for our young people, elders, and women. To understand the severity of this, consider that several First Nations of Manitoba, including Lake St. Martin First Nation, remain displaced from floods, which occurred in 2011. In fact, in 2015, more than 4,500 First Nations citizens in Canada remained displaced from their homes due to flooding. Article 5 of the International Law Commission's draft articles of state responsibility in emergency situations states that human rights must be respected in emergency situations. The Commission specifically calls for states to protect and promote the inherent dignity of the human person and states that countries are obligated to ensure disaster responses in a non-discriminatory fashion. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the most comprehensive instrument elaborating the rights of Indigenous peoples and should be the key starting point for any consideration of both individual and collective rights. Although the Declaration does not explicitly address disaster reduction, several of its provisions have implications for the promotion and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights in this area and can provide for the design and implementation of sound disaster reduction strategies and interventions. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada has pledged to adopt and implement, also addresses the rights of Indigenous peoples to participate in disaster risk reduction processes. Articles 19 and 32, which address free, prior, and informed consent, can also provide guidance in the context of disaster risk reduction. In applying these articles, it becomes clear that states have the obligation to consult with Indigenous peoples and to seek to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent concerning risk reduction measures that may affect them. Risk reduction is more likely to be successful if Indigenous decision-making processes and traditional knowledge are respected. In the regional context, this is one of the reasons the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is critical. The Declaration provides an articulation of the minimum standards of treatment for Indigenous peoples, a floor, not a ceiling. The obligations of the American Declaration regarding education, health, culture, and language are more important in emergency situations because these are the periods when Indigenous peoples are most vulnerable. How do we best promote meaningful disaster and risk reduction? First, by closing the gap between Indigenous peoples and other peoples in society. One of the greatest forms of risk posed to First Nations is the existence of inadequate infrastructure, which is more vulnerable to any form of extreme weather event. Imagine a First Nation that is flooded. The majority of already deteriorated houses becomes further infested by mold. This in turn leads to chronic illnesses such as COPD and other respiratory illnesses caused by inhaling mold. Young people become displaced from their homes, often relocated to hotels and motels outside of their home communities and away from their schools for indefinite periods, often moving from one overcrowded situation to another. They encounter significant obstacles to re-enroll into, settle into, and experience success in new schools. All in all, the impacts of natural disasters exacerbate Indigenous people's daily lived experiences. All countries must focus on assessing and addressing the infrastructure deficit in Indigenous communities. However, addressing the infrastructure deficit is not enough. Many, and indeed most, Indigenous peoples use traditional knowledge and traditional technologies to ensure resilience to extreme weather events. Countries and Indigenous peoples must work together to implement solutions based on traditional technologies and traditional knowledge. Our cultures are not artifacts of a long forgotten past. No, indeed, they are the key to a resilient and sustainable future for all of us. If we work together to promote, advance, and implement Indigenous cultures, technologies, and knowledge while developing more sustainable and resilient infrastructures for Indigenous peoples, we can achieve a just and lasting reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and states. A future founded on fulfillment of fundamental human rights, resiliency, and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Mackinac, for your fitting words. You certainly brought it home with concrete examples. A home with mold. Nobody should have to live that way, and yet many do. Thank you once again, Chief Mackinac. Estoy muy contenta de estar aquí con ustedes y de constatar sus esfuerzos diarios por reducir los riesgos de desastres. Todo un logro. Es admirable el excelente trabajo que realizan ustedes todos los días para que el Canadá, las Américas y este mundo sean mejor. Speaking of the world, let's continue visiting my beautiful country and talk about our diversity and our openness to others. We could still improve. The whole world has to learn. We all have to be more open. But we are really pretty good here in Canada. Now is the time to invite Robert Glasser, Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, to speak to us. Mr. Robert Glasser.
Thank you. Minister Goodall, I know, has left, but will be back later. Public Safety Canada, Mr. Martin Courtier, Minister Public Safety Quebec, Ms. Annie Sampson, Vice President of the Executive Committee, City of Montreal, distinguished Indigenous elders, distinguished ministers and vice ministers, distinguished delegates of UN member states of the Americas and national Sendai focal points, representatives of intergovernmental and international organizations. You can see I'm from the United Nations with the introductions. Colleagues from the United Nations, representatives of stakeholder groups, civil society, mayors, the private sector, academia, women's groups, parliamentarians, media representatives, ladies and gentlemen. That was the hardest part of my job. Bonjour, chers participants d'Amérique. Il me fait très plaisir d'être à Montréal avec vous à l'occasion de la Plataforma Regional 2017. Espero también que no hayan sufrido accidentes con las calles congelados, para ustedes que hablan español también. It is a really great honor for me to be here today to address you at this opening ceremony of the 5th Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in the Americas. I'd like to start by expressing my sincere thanks to the Government of Canada for hosting this important gathering and also for their many enlightened initiatives in the area of disaster risk more generally. This is the first regional platform in the Americas since the UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction hosted by Japan in March 2 years ago, at which this really remarkable agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, was adopted. The framework emphasizes the importance of moving from managing disasters to managing disaster risk, from essentially just waiting and responding to humanitarian disasters. And we've clearly seen there's inadequate resources to meet the growing need to try to get out in front to focus on prevention. And that is the only way we're going to achieve the target set in the Sendai Framework of reducing disaster mortality, the number of people affected, the economic losses and damage to critical infrastructure by the deadline set in that agreement, 2030. Disaster events, as the minister pointed out in his presentation over the last 12 months here in the Americas, have highlighted how challenging it's going to be to achieve those targets. Hurricane Matthew last October was the first Category 5 Atlantic hurricane in almost 10 years and was a stern test of the region's preparedness for an event, actually an event we're likely to see much more of, or similar events in future as a result of climate change. In Haiti alone, there were 546 officially confirmed deaths and 128 people missing, which is truly disturbing when you consider the enormous aid effort in the country following the mega disaster after the 2010 earthquake. It also underscores how important it is for governments and aid donors to accelerate efforts to improve multi-hazard early warning systems, a topic that I know it will be discussed at this meeting and also the focus of a 2-day conference at the Global Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Cancun in May. Hurricane Matthew also caused damage estimated to be in excess of $15 billion as it cut a swath across Haiti, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, the Bahamian Archipelago, the southeastern United States, and the Canadian Maritimes. It's a further reminder of the toll which disasters take on scarce resources, which should be better invested in productive areas such as health and education, particularly in low and middle income countries, which can least afford these losses. Our indigenous elders in the meeting before coming here commented that it is very important to be humble in the face of nature in planet Earth, and there's nothing that enables us to appreciate that more than when we face the power of an earthquake or a tsunami or the enormously powerful natural and other disasters that should remind us of that. In Haiti, economic losses were estimated at US $2.78 billion, or 32% of GDP. And this is a country where over 55% of the population live below the poverty line. In terms of the region's effort to build resilience to disasters, it was really heartening to note the concerted effort made in many countries in Latin America to reduce the impact of the 2014 to 2016 El Niño and subsequent relatively mild La Niña. This was a major slow onset disaster event which intensified an ongoing drought in Central America affecting over 3.5 million people. There were also floods such as those experienced in Asunción, Paraguay, and affecting 15,000 families. However, the event was not as severe as previous episodes in the 80s and 90s, and several countries had preparedness plans in place. Just to mention a few that I'm aware of, in Costa Rica, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, as well in Central America, allocated significant budgetary support to preparing for El Niño. It's efforts such as these that we must now build on as we prepare to meet the first deadline of the Sendai Framework, the substantial increase in national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. These strategies will lay the foundation for a decade of concerted action on reducing disaster losses. I'm sure the outcome of this regional platform will give added impetus to these efforts, which were already signaled in the outcome document from the first meeting of ministers and high-level authorities on the implementation of the Sendai Framework, which I attended last June in Paraguay. I want to recall in particular the guidance document, outcome document from Asunción. Among other things, the guidelines called for the adoption of a set of progress indicators in accordance with the indicators recommended by the open-ended intergovernmental working group, which was this intergovernmental group that developed the indicators for each of the targets set in the Sendai Framework. And those indicators were adopted, by the way, last month by the General Assembly. My own view is that adoption of these indicators to track progress on achieving the 7 targets of the Sendai Framework is a tremendous achievement and a vote in favor of global accountability to achieve the reduction in disaster risk. As we look toward the 2020 deadline, we must ensure close coordination and coherence with other international agreements and processes, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and of course the Paris Agreement on climate change, because climate risk, and there's a very close connection, much overlap between climate risk and disaster risk more broadly. There is a clear opportunity to avoid duplication of effort by ensuring that the plans for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction complement each other and make the best use of available resources, as well as reducing the burden on member states to report against these international frameworks that have been set up. We also recognize that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is arguably the single most urgent global disaster risk treatment, because without those efforts, our other efforts to reduce many hazards and the risks those pose to communities will be overwhelmed over the longer term. The government of our host country, Canada, is leading the world in this endeavor, following its pledge to cut greenhouse gas emissions 30% from 2005 levels by 2030, and a plan introduced last October to put a price on carbon. The pledges made at the Paris Climate Conference, COP21, will only get the world halfway to where we need to be in order to keep global warming at less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Of course, you don't have to accept the very convincing science of climate change to realize and appreciate and support the need to reduce disaster risk more broadly. Otherwise, we're going to see a further escalation if these greenhouse gases aren't reduced in weather and climate-related disaster events, severe storms, droughts, and floods fueled by rising temperatures and rising sea level, with cascading impacts on the risk of fires, food security, and as we've seen in Syria and in Darfur and in many places around the world, even conflict. Already we know that these hydrometeorological events have doubled over the last few decades and now account for 90% of all disasters caused by natural hazards. Climate change adaptation and mitigation are inextricably linked to disaster risk reduction, and we should not lose sight of that as action plans are developed to achieve the Sendai Framework targets. The regional plan of action you will adopt this week will help and guide national and local governments in their efforts